In 1442, the greatest inventor in Joseon Korea disappeared. Not died, not retired, not assassinated. Disappeared. It was the 24th year of King Sejong the Great. The water clocks at Gyeongbokgung Palace still struck themselves on the hour, the way Jang Yeong-sil had built them to. The sundials in the public squares of Hansung still cast their shadows across animal figures, the way he had carved them. The man himself, however, was gone. One day his name was in the official records of the royal court, a senior third-rank official, the king's personal protege, the man who had built the clocks of the palace, the sundials of the capital, and the world's first standardized rain gauge. The next, he was gone. No death date, no funeral record, no mention in any chronicle of the dynasty that lasted another 450 years. For a court official of his rank, this is not just unusual. It is impossible. We know his name, Jang Yeong-sil. We know that he was beaten with 80 lashes after a royal sedan chair he had supervised broke beneath the king. We know he was demoted and expelled from the palace. And then the historical record falls silent, completely, deliberately, forever. What we do not know is whether he died from his wounds, fled to China, was murdered by his political enemies, or was quietly hidden by the king who loved him most. In 2019, Korean director Ha Jin-ho released a film called Forbidden Dream, Chunmoon in Korean, starring Suk-kyu as King Sejong and Choi Min-sik as Jang Yeong-sil. The film imagines the bond between the king and the slave-born inventor whose mind built the future of Joseon. But the actual history is stranger and more brutal than any film. Because to understand why Jang Yeong-sil disappeared, you have to understand who he was, where he came from, and why his existence was a problem so dangerous that it had to be erased. This is the story of the man who built the most advanced scientific instruments of the 15th century, while bound by a law that said his children would be slaves forever. This is the story of Jang Yeong-sil. He was born around the year 1390 in a place that the official records call Dongnae, a small county in the southeast of the Korean peninsula, near modern Busan. His father was a man named Jang Seung-wi. According to the annals of King Sejong, Jang Seung-wi was of Yuan Chinese descent. His family had come from the region of Suzhou and Hangzhou in southern China, possibly during the collapse of the Yuan dynasty in the late 1300s, when refugees scattered across East Asia. By the time Jang Yeong-sil was born, his father's family had been in Korea for generations, but they were no longer aristocrats. They were poor. His mother was a gisang, a government-registered female entertainer attached to the local civil court of Dongnae. In Joseon, Korea, gisang were not slaves in the chattel sense, but they were not free either. They belonged to the state. And Joseon law was very clear about what happened to children born to such women. The legal principle was called Jangmo-bup, the matrilineal slavery rule. Under Jangmo-bup, a child inherited the social status of the mother, not the father. If your mother was a slave, you were a slave. If your mother was a gisang of the government, you became a guan-no, a government slave. So Jang Yeong-sil was born into bondage. He was the property of the Dongnae County office. His labor, his time, his future were not his own. Under the rigid Confucian caste system of Joseon, his life was already written. He would serve, he would obey, he would die in obscurity, and his children, if he was permitted to have any, would inherit his servitude. This was not unusual, it was the system. Across Joseon, hundreds of thousands of people lived as nobi, slaves of varying degrees, owned by the state, the temples, or the aristocratic Yongbang class. They built things, they cooked, they cleaned. They were the invisible foundation on which the elite scholar officials wrote their poetry and debated their philosophy. But occasionally, a slave was discovered to have an extraordinary skill. What Jang Yeong-sil could do with his hands and his mind was something the Dongnae County officials had never seen before. He could repair broken machines, he could build new ones, he could look at a complex mechanism and understand it. Word of his ability traveled. It traveled north. It traveled to the capital. it traveled all the way to the throne. In the early years of the 15th century, the throne belonged to King Taejong, the third king of the Joseon Dynasty, a former general who had personally killed his half-brothers to seize power. Taejong was a hard man, but he was also pragmatic, and he understood something that many of his contemporaries did not, that talent was talent, regardless of where it came from. The historical records suggest that Taejong was the first king to take an interest in Jang Yeong-sil. The exact details are debated. Some accounts say Taejong personally summoned him to the capital. Others suggest the recognition was more gradual. What is clear is that by the time Taejong abdicated in 1418 and his third son, Sejong, took the throne, Jang Yeong-sil was no longer just a county slave. He was being watched by the court. Sejong was 21 years old when he became king. He would reign for 32 years. He is the only Korean king ever called the Great. He invented the Korean alphabet, Hangul, to allow his commoners to read and write. He sponsored agricultural reform, military innovation, and a flourishing of arts and sciences that historians still call the Korean Golden Age. And within the first few years of his reign, Sejong made a decision that would shape the history of Korean science for centuries. He sent Jang Yeong-sil to China. In approximately 1421, Jang traveled to Beijing, then the capital of the Ming Dynasty, alongside two court astronomers named Yoon Sa-un and Choi Chun-gu. Their mission was to study. They spent roughly a year in Beijing, examining the most advanced astronomical instruments of the age: water clocks, armillary spheres, observational devices. They read texts from Chinese, Persian, and Arab sources. This was unprecedented. A government slave had been entrusted with a state diplomatic mission to the Ming court. The decision to send him reportedly drew immediate objections from the Confucian scholar officials at court, the Yangban class, who guarded their monopoly on learning fiercely. But Sejong sent him anyway. And when Jang Yeong-sil returned to Korea, sometime around 1422 or 1423, he came back with the knowledge that would let him build instruments that did not yet exist anywhere in the world. And Sejong was waiting for him with a question that the Joseon court had never been asked before. What would happen if a slave became a senior official? Joseon Korea was a society built on rigid social classes. At the top stood the Yangban, the scholar aristocrats who passed civil service examinations and ran the government. Below them were the Jungin, the technical specialists. Below them, the commoners, and below the commoners, in the lowest stratum of legal personhood, the nobi, the slaves. The boundaries between these classes were not just social. They were legal, hereditary, and absolute. A slave's son was a slave. A Yangban's son was a Yangban. The system had been refined over centuries to be self-perpetuating and impossible to escape. When Jang Yeong-sil returned from China, Sejong did something the Joseon court had not seen before. He removed him from the slave registers, a formal act of manumission known as Myunchun, and gave him a fifth-rank government appointment, a position normally reserved for the sons of established Yangban families. The court erupted. The annals of King Sejong record the objections in detail. Senior officials petitioned the king. The Confucian scholars warned that elevating a former slave to government rank would corrupt the social order, undermine the moral foundation of the state, and set a precedent that would invite chaos. Sejong refused to back down, and he had an unexpected ally, the Prime Minister, Hwang Hui. Hwang Hui was one of the most respected statesmen in Joseon history. When the protests against Jang's promotion reached their peak, Hwang Hui addressed the court with a single argument. Since the reign of King Taejong, he said, there have been many people who rose to high government posts from humble origins. The precedent existed. The law allowed it. The objection was not principle, it was prejudice. The protests were silenced, and then Jang Yeong-sil's career did something that in the entire 800-year history of the Korean civil service had almost no parallel. He was promoted again, and again, and again, from bourgeois, a low-court technical position, to Hogun, a fourth-rank military officer's title. From Hogun to Daehogun, junior third rank. From Daehogun to Songhogun, senior third rank. By the late 1430s, Jang Yeong-sil, the slave from Dongnae, the son of a Giseng, the man who by law should not have been allowed to own property, was a senior third-rank official of the Joseon government. He had a household, he had servants, he had a salary higher than most of the men who had spent their entire lives passing the civil service examinations to get there. And he had something even more dangerous. He had the king's complete, unwavering trust. To understand what Jang Yeong-sil built next, you have to understand what time meant in 15th century Korea. Time was not a private possession. It was a state function. The court determined the hours, the seasons, the agricultural cycles, the ritual calendars. The act of measuring time was a sacred power, a connection between the king and the heavens. And in early Joseon, that power was being measured by a method that was frankly embarrassing. The palace timekeepers used water clocks, clepsydras, that required constant human attention. Officials had to watch the water level, calculate the hour, and manually strike a bell to mark the time. When officials grew tired, missed their shifts, or made errors, the entire capital lost track of time. Bells failed to ring, court schedules collapsed. The king's authority looked foolish. Sejong wanted something better. In particular, he wanted what the great Chinese astronomer Su Song had built more than 3 centuries earlier, in the 1090s. An automatic clock that could strike itself, requiring no human operator. The Chinese clock had been lost to history. The technology had to be rebuilt from scratch. In 1433, Jang Yeong-sil completed his first major instrument, the Honchanui, an armillary sphere driven by a water wheel. It could track the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, automatically rotating to reflect the celestial sphere. And then, in 1434, he built something that no one in Korea had ever seen, the Joseon, the self-striking water clock. It was installed in a special pavilion at Gyeongbokgung Palace called Borugak. The mechanism was extraordinary. Water flowed at a precisely calibrated rate through a series of vessels. As the water level rose in a measuring tank, it triggered a sequence of rods and levers. Small balls dropped from one container to another, releasing wooden time figures dressed in ceremonial robes. The figures bowed, struck bells, gongs, and drums to announce the hours and the watches of the night. There were 12 wooden figures, one for each 2-hour traditional Korean time period, corresponding to the 12 zodiac animals. The Joseon became the official national timekeeper of Joseon. From it, all other clocks in the kingdom were synchronized. The act of striking time, once dependent on whether a human attendant happened to be paying attention, was now mechanical, precise, and absolute. Jang Yeong-sil had taken time itself out of human hands. 4 years later, in 1438, he completed his masterpiece, the Ongnu, also called the Hungyongak Pavilion Clock. This was not just a clock, it was a miniature universe. A 5-tier artificial mountain stood inside the pavilion, populated with automated figures representing peasants planting and harvesting rice through the 4 seasons. The sun and moon moved across a domed ceiling. The mechanism integrated timekeeping, astronomy, agriculture, and royal symbolism into a single working machine. The internal mechanism of the Ongnu was eventually lost. We have descriptions, but no surviving original. What we know is that for a brief moment in the 1430s, a former slave from Dongnae had built one of the most extraordinary mechanical instruments operating anywhere in the world. But the most politically radical thing Jang Yeong-sil ever built was not in a palace. It was in the street. In the same year that he built the Joseon, 1434, Jang and a team of court astronomers, including Yi Sun-ji, designed a new kind of sundial called the Angbu-ilgu. The name means hemispherical dial, a concave bronze bowl with markings inside, a slender metal rod casting a shadow across the curved surface. It was beautiful. It was accurate to within minutes, and it was meant to be touched. Sejong ordered 2 of the Angbu-ilgu installed in public spaces in Hansung, the capital. One was placed at the Haejunggyo Bridge, a busy thoroughfare crossing a stream in the heart of the city. The other was placed at the entrance to Jeonmyo, the royal ancestral shrine. Both locations were chosen because thousands of commoners passed by every day. This decision, to place a sundial in a public square, accessible to anyone, was politically radical in a way that may be hard to grasp today. In Joseon, the measurement of time was the king's prerogative. The court announced the hours through bell towers. The agricultural calendar was distributed by the state. To know the time was, in a sense, to share in royal authority. By putting a working clock in a public street, Sejong was redistributing that authority. He was telling his commoners, most of whom could not read, that they had a right to know the hour without asking permission. Imagine a peasant woman in 1434 crossing the Haejunggyo Bridge to fetch water from the stream. She has never been taught to read. She has never owned a piece of paper. Her entire life has been timed by sun, by hunger, by the bell of the official announcement tower somewhere in the distance. And now, on the bronze surface of a curved bowl set into the public square, she sees a rat, an ox, a tiger, a rabbit. She traces the shadow with her finger. For the first time in her life, she doesn't need a man in robes to tell her what hour it is. She can simply look, and she knows. And because most commoners could not read Chinese characters, Jang Yeong-sil engraved the sundial markings with images. 12 animal figures from the Korean zodiac: rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, sheep, monkey, rooster, dog, pig, marked the hours. Anyone could read it. A child could read it. A farmer could read it. A peasant woman crossing the bridge to fetch water could read it. Modern historians, including the Asia Society in their public scholarship on Sejong, have described this decision as the king sharing his power with his people. That is not metaphor. That is what it was. And it made the Yangban deeply uncomfortable. We do not have explicit records of court protests against the public sundial specifically. Every time Sejong tried to make knowledge or technology accessible to commoners, he faced resistance from the scholar aristocrats, who saw the social hierarchy as the natural and necessary order of things. The original Sejong-era Angbu-ilgu were destroyed in 1592 during the Japanese invasion of Korea, the Imjin War. Every surviving example today is a later reproduction. But for 150 years before that, in the heart of Hansung, a sundial stood in a public square, marked with animal figures so that the illiterate could read the time. It was the work of a former slave, sponsored by a king, intended for the people, and it was just the beginning. In 1441, Jang Yeong-sil, now in his early 50s, at the peak of his career, completed the invention that may be his most globally significant contribution: the Chul-gu-gi, the standardized rain gauge. The concept was simple: a bronze cylinder mounted on a stone pedestal, approximately 30 centimeters tall and 14 centimeters in diameter, 1 foot 5 inches by 7 inches in the Joseon measurements of the day. Rain fell into the cylinder. The depth of accumulated water was measured with a graduated ruler. The amount was recorded. The annals of King Sejong record that the original idea for the rain gauge came from Sejong's eldest son, the crown prince, who would later become King Moonjong. Jang Yeong-sil's role appears to have been the engineering and manufacture rather than the original concept. This is a point that historians emphasize. Like most of the great Sejong-era innovations, the Chul-gu-gi was a collaborative achievement, with Jang as the master craftsman who turned ideas into working instruments. What made the Chul-gu-gi revolutionary was not the device itself, it was the standardization. In 1442, the Joseon government distributed identical rain gauges to provincial offices across the entire country. Every county was required to record rainfall using the same standardized instrument. The data was reported back to the capital and compiled. For the first time in human history, a national government was systematically collecting standardized meteorological data. This predated similar efforts in Europe by approximately 200 years. Christopher Wren, the English architect who designed St. Paul's Cathedral in London, built a tipping bucket rain gauge around 1662. By the time Wren's gauge was being used in England, the Joseon government had been operating its national rain measurement network for 2¼ centuries. Why did this matter so much? Because it allowed the state to do something it had never been able to do before. With reliable, standardized rainfall data from every province, the government could assess agricultural yields with unprecedented accuracy. It could adjust tax assessments based on actual crop conditions, not estimates. It could anticipate famines. It could plan irrigation projects. It could, in essence, govern based on data rather than tradition. The Chuguggi was the foundation of evidence-based agricultural policy in Korea. Alongside it, Jang built the Suk-kyu, a water gauge installed in the Chunggaecheon stream in Honsung to measure river levels. Together, the rain gauge and the water gauge gave Joseon a complete picture of its hydrological situation. It is worth pausing here to consider the full scope of what Jang Yeong-sil had accomplished. By 1441, he had personally led the design or manufacture of the most accurate water clock in East Asia, the most beautiful celestial sphere in Korean history, the first publicly accessible sundial, the most sophisticated automated astronomical mechanism of the age, and now the world's first standardized meteorological instrument. He had become indispensable, which in Joseon court politics was an extremely dangerous thing to be. It happened in 1442, the 24th year of King Sejong's reign. Sejong, who suffered from chronic illness throughout his later years, was traveling to a hot spring in Icheon, a town southeast of the capital famous for its medicinal waters. The king traveled in an anyu, an ornate royal sedan chair, carried by attendants. The sedan chair had been designed under the supervision of Jang Yeong-sil. During the journey, the chair broke. The historical records do not clearly state whether King Sejong was injured. Some popular accounts describe the king being thrown to the ground. The actual annals are notably restrained on this point. What the records do make clear is what happened next. The court erupted. For the Yangban faction that had spent 2 decades opposing Jang Yeong-sil's existence at court, this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The king's safety had been compromised. The slave-born inventor had failed in his most basic duty. He had to be punished. Jang Yeong-sil was sentenced to 80 lashes. Popular accounts often say 100, but the annals indicate 80. He was demoted from his rank. He was imprisoned for an extended period, and then he was expelled from the royal palace. The annals suggest that Sejong personally opposed the harshness of the punishment, but eventually yielded to court pressure. This is not unusual in the Joseon political system. Even the most powerful king governed through consensus with the scholar officials, and there were limits to what he could force through against unanimous opposition. What happened to Jang Yeong-sil after the expulsion is the great mystery. There is no death record. There is no funeral entry. There is no mention of him in any subsequent document of the Joseon court. For a senior third-rank official, a man whose career had been documented in the annals for 2 full decades, to simply vanish from the record is, by the standards of Korean historical archives, almost impossible. 3 main theories have been proposed. None of them can be confirmed. The first theory is the simplest. Jang Yeong-sil was an old man. By 1442, he was in his early 50s, an elderly age by 15th century standards. 80 lashes was a punishment that could kill a young man. He may simply have died from his injuries, and his death may have been omitted from the records because of the political circumstances surrounding his fall. The second theory is darker. Some modern historians have suggested that the Sedan Chair incident may not have been an accident. The Yangban faction had every motive to engineer Jang's downfall, and the timing, at the peak of his career, when he had become indispensable to Sejong, is suspicious. Under this theory, the broken Sedan Chair was sabotage, The punishment was excessive on purpose, and Jang's disappearance from the record was the deliberate erasure of an inconvenient figure. The third theory is the most romantic. Jang, it suggests, knew what was coming. He could not protect Jang from formal punishment without losing the political battle. So he allowed the punishment to proceed, then quietly arranged for Jang to disappear, to retreat to obscurity, to live out his life under a different name in some remote province, perhaps even to return to his ancestral region near Asan. Under this theory, the absence of records is not erasure, but protection. We do not know. There is a tomb in Asan, in Chungcheongnam-do province, that local tradition identifies as the resting place of Jang Yeong-sil. It is officially considered abandoned, historically unauthenticated, more memorial than verified grave. No one has ever proven that he is buried there. No one has proven that he is not. The inventions he built outlived him by centuries. The Jagyeongnu was rebuilt and used as the national clock for over 400 years. The Chugugi rain gauge network operated in modified forms until the modern era. The Angbu-ilgu sundials in their public squares were destroyed by Japanese invasion in 1592. But the design lived on. Korean museums today display dozens of historically faithful reproductions. In 1991, the Korea Industrial Technology Association established the IR-52 Jang Yeong-sil Award, the most prestigious industrial technology prize in the country. One Korean industrial product is selected each week, 52 per year, for engineering excellence. The award is named after him. In October 2025, the Republic of Korea Navy held the launching ceremony for a new submarine class. The lead vessel was named the Jang Yeong-sil, a submarine, sleek, technologically advanced, the most sophisticated weapons platform in Korea's modern arsenal, bearing the name of the slave who built water clocks 500 years earlier. In 2019, director Ha Jin-ho released the film Forbidden Dream, Chunmoon, in Korean. Han Suk-kyu played King Sejong. Choi Min-sik played Jang Yeong-sil. The film centers on the bond between the two men, the king and the slave-born genius, and culminates in the broken Sedan Chair and Jang's disappearance. It does not solve the mystery. It cannot. But it reminds an audience, 21st century Koreans, and the global viewers who have discovered the film through Netflix Korea and YouTube clips, that this story actually happened. A boy was born in a southern county around the year 1390 to a Chinese-descended father and a court entertainer mother. By Joseon law, he was a slave. He should have lived and died in obscurity, his existence a footnote in a county ledger. Instead, he built the most sophisticated scientific instruments of the 15th century. He measured the heavens. He standardized the rain. He put a clock in a public square so that illiterate farmers could read the time. He was promoted to senior third rank by a king who saw what the scholar aristocrats could not, that genius is a gift, not a birthright. And then, because the world was not ready for what he was beaten and erased. The Yangban won that round. They removed him from the court. They erased him from the record, for whatever reason. They tried to ensure that no future slave would ever be allowed to rise as he had risen. It did not work. 500 years later, in a country he would not recognize, in a society he could not have imagined, the name they tried to erase is on a Navy submarine. It is on a science museum. It is on the highest industrial technology award his nation gives. It is on a Netflix film watched in apartments from Seoul to Sao Paulo. Jang Yeong-sil disappeared in 1442.